All right, hi, my name is Jason Clark. I'm the Jason that Eddie, the bald Jason that Doug was referring to, and the follically challenged Jason. I promise I did have hair at one point. Like, no hair, no hair again. That's life. So today what I'm going to be talking about is iOS. I'm also going to build an app, but this one is not going to start from the ground up. In fact, I'm actually taking one of the samples in the SDK called Hello Facebook, which is very, very simple. It's actually a lot like what Eddie just built. And then from there, I'm going to add some Open Graph support. And then we'll also talk about some odds and ends like error handling and performance. All right, so you probably saw a slide something like this one earlier in the day. We're Facebook. This is the social graph. A little known fact, I am actually at the center of the social graph, which is a big responsibility, but somebody has to do it. And connected to me are my friends and the things we all care about. And what we're going to be talking about in this session when we get to Open Graph is actually a very specific piece of this graph, which is the arc between usually a person and something, which we call an action. So it's kind of like, it's the verb in this whole equation, the listen or the send or the run or what have you. And the way I kind of look at this, and I don't know if it's like the right mental model, but basically people generate stories, and that's one of the things that keeps folks engaged with Facebook, because we care about one another and we care about the things that we care about and so forth, and these stories show up on our news feed. What Open Graph lets us do is extend that story generation capability to applications. So it increases engagement and distribution of the application. Anyhow, so it allows your application to be part of the social graph. And part of this, it's kind of a handshake between the application developer and Facebook in the sense that if you have an application that posts a bunch of things to Facebook that have absolutely nothing to do with what the application does, that's going to confuse users. They're going to think that's odd, and it's probably not going to increase engagement. But if it's nicely integrated, if it makes sense, if it's related to what the application does, if it gives folks access to their friends in ways that it couldn't, or reach into their friends' news feeds or interaction with them in ways that make sense, then suddenly you get this kind of virtuous cycle where folks are using the application, their friends recognize they're using the application and get new data about what their friends are doing, even if they're not users of the app. All right, so that's kind of the stage-setting part for Open Graph. All right, so we talked in the previous session about the architecture here of the SDK that we're going to be going through. And in the next couple of slides, I'll break it down. But what a big part of the session that we're going to be going through here, or what a big part of the architecture that we're going to be going through, is this middle layer here, which is focused on Graph API. OK, so I need to switch now to my machine. And what I have on the machine is a sample application. Let me switch over to something a little more humanish. So this is a sample application. I'm going to run it in a second, which does very, very simple things. It lets you post your status update. It lets you pick some friends, things like that. And I'm going to run it now. The only thing I've changed in this from what we actually ship in the sample itself is I went into the plist and I changed the app ID to my own demo app ID so that when I go in today and actually add Open Graph integration, it doesn't change the actual app that's out there live for the sample. But other than that, this is line for line the same as what's in the sample in the SDK for now. All right, so let me build and run this thing. It was already running, which caused an alarm bell. Hold on one second. I did not get myself into a reset state, which could cause us trouble. All right, so let me run it again. All right, so this thing's going to pop up. It's not logged in right now. If I click Login, it's going to want to transition to Safari, and then I can log in and all that other kind of stuff. Probably you're already used to the way that works. But I'm not going to do that. I'm going to use the new Facebook integration in iOS. And I am going to log on as my test user, Fred. Sign in. Let's see if I typed that correctly. I did, I guess. And now we'll go back to the application, click Login, And this is that dialog box that Eddie showed you earlier in the session. This is iOS saying, hey, do you want to trust the Hello Facebook sample to act on your behalf with Facebook? So I'll say yes. Or Fred will say yes. And we go and fetch some information about Fred, including his profile picture. And just to give you an example of how the sample works to start with, here's that friend picker that we saw before. So this is kind of our baseline. And now what we're going to do is we're going to add, I'm actually going to kill off this functionality, and I'm going to replace it with a couple of Open Graph posts that post actions that Fred is taking with the application. All right. So to do that, I'm going to go back to the app tool. Actually, show of hands, how many of you have used this app tool at Facebook to at least tinker? All right, so it's looking like maybe a little over half. I'm just trying to set my pace and how fast to go through this part of it. So I created this app. I didn't really make a whole lot of changes to it. It's mostly in its vanilla state, but let me go through a few things that I did change. So one is I added the bundle ID for the application that I'm building. And probably the most important thing I did is I added my test users as developers to this application. And what that lets me do is it lets me interact with the Open Graph actions with these users, despite the fact that the Open Graph objects and actions for this app have not yet been submitted to Facebook and approved. So if they weren't developers of the app, all of their requests would fail. All right, but other than that, this is pretty much the default settings for the app. And what I'm going to do now is click on the Edit Open Graph button, which brings us to the Getting Started pane for Open Graph, which is kind of like a little wizard to get you going. And once you get your first action and object set up, then if you want to, you can either go back to the Getting Started or you can go to the dashboard, which you see over here, to use more of a, I guess, advanced way to add additional objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a verb, an action, called say, and then I'm going to add a object called greeting. So since the theme of this sample application is Hello Facebook, the actions that I'm going to add into the system are the ability to say and then a greeting. This does take a second. And when it completes, it's going to pop up, and I'll be able to look at the various properties and attributes of the action. All right, so I'm still in that wizard mode that I mentioned a second ago. And if I pop this up for a second, you can see that, actions have a set of common properties that all actions have. And we'll end up in our application setting them in a minute. But for now, the one thing we'll focus on is the custom property here, greeting, which is a reference to an object that we'll create in a minute. So I'm going to scroll down. And what most of this here is there's some customization capability. For example, if I wanted to, I could customize the way an item gets expressed and say, well, I would like, in addition to the default behavior, say the title of a greeting to be right here. That's not refreshing correctly, but it would do the right thing when we actually ran the code. And then I'm going to save this and go to the next step. And the next step lets me set up the object that I described. So I had an action. Now I'm moving on to the object. And the object, like the action, also has a set of default properties. And the one in this sample that we're going to use most rigorously is its URL, which we'll come back to in a second. And for this, I'm just going to keep the default settings. But I do want to show you kind of a little preview here of what an Open Graph story might look like on somebody's newsfeed. All right, so I'm going to click Save. And aggregations I'm going to, for now, just kind of zip past. But what they do is they allow you to customize the way multiple stories get rolled up into a single meta story, so to speak. And then I'm going to click Save and Finish. All right, so this now gets us to the dashboard view on the developer app tool for the objects that we've just created. And recapping, I have the say action and I have the greeting object. And one of the things that I think now is a good time to kind of go through some of the conceptual aspects of this is that your application is going to be, by and large, generating actions. And yet you still need objects to wire things to. So in this case, I have a fairly straightforward graph with two types of nodes, the action node and the greeting node. And the greeting objects need to be somehow created for Facebook. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to create some sample greeting objects right now, and then the app will generate actions that are wired up to those greetings. In a moment, we'll talk about how your application can dynamically create objects and actions, but not from your phone. It does involve a web tier. All right, so I'm going to click on Add Sample Data, and this is a straightforward way of saying, okay, look, I've got this greeting object. I'd like a little sample data so that I can actually start the development process with my application. So what I'm going to do is create a greeting called hello. And I'm going to go to Google here and type hello. And my experience here is that if I type the word word, then it gives me a reasonable number of images. So I'm going to steal one of these URLs. I have no idea if I'm infringing on somebody's IP. But I'll do that. I'll click Create. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a sample object of type greeting, whose title is hello, or which title is hello. And then if I click over here on Debug, this takes us to another useful tool on the server-side tool set, which allows me to type in the URL of an object, and I'll get interesting information about it. In this case, this is an object of type greeting. The namespace for my app is Jackal. That's my alias at Facebook. MDD. And here's that image. And the URL for this object is right here, which I'll click over to that. And what that does, when we do the sample objects like this, it gives you a very simple vanilla page that shows you what the actual meta tags are in the source for this. Now, what's actually happening here is that Facebook scrapes those meta tags in order to get the image and things like that for the object, so it knows what to put inside of the feed. If you were serving up objects from a web server, you could populate those meta tags with whatever content that you wanted to from your server. All right, so I'm going to do this one more time. This time from, or I'll add another greeting object called hi, so that we have two to work with in our application, and then we'll switch over to code. All right, so hi. I'll do that same little Google trick. I'll take this graffiti hippie-looking one here, and then go back to the tool, paste in the URL, again, create again. And once again, you end up with the same basic infrastructure here to look at. I'll click on Debug so that we can see that one as well. And it's of the same type, greeting, but its title is different, its image is different. In this case, it's the hi greeting. And I'll click on the URL here as well, because I actually will use those in just a minute. All right, so now, recapping, let me go back to my slides. This first step here of the demo actually didn't have any code. I did show you what the app runs like. Can we go back to slides? Yes. So we're not yet looking at the components in the code, but we've looked at the app tool. We've set up some very basic things. We've got a open graph type, an open graph action, and then two sample instances of the object type. OK, so now let me move forward here. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to go through some code to actually post those actions to our user's timeline. All right, so back to code. And starting out, I'm going to come in here and repurpose these first two buttons. I'll make the first one be my hello button. And the second one will be my hi button. All right. All right. And then let's switch over to code. So in my code, wow, I need a little real estate here. In fact, let me get a lot there. So these first two methods here, which are my click handlers, I'm just going to gut completely. from the sample. And this is where we'll build out our code for posting these actions. So this is no longer true. This one is just my hello case, and this one will be hi. All right? And then I'm also going to add a method called post say action with greeting, and then in a string star, and I'll have it take a URL. All right. So a little bit more setup work, and then we'll start jumping into the protocols that Eddie mentioned in the previous session. So here I'll say self post say action with greeting. And what I'm going to pass here is one of these URLs. So since this is the hello case, I'm going to go back to the hello object. I'm going to steal that URL. I could actually use the URL or the object ID to represent this particular instance to Facebook, but since I have a URL handy here, I'm going to do that. And I will paste it in. And then very similar code here, only I will steal the hi URL. All right, so now we are to the point where if I fill in this method with code to post an open graph action, now my application has been retooled and it's no longer posting a status, it's posting something more structured, and we can control what the story looks like on the user's feed and things like that. All right, so first step, I'm going to scroll to the top here and I'm going to add some protocols. So at protocol, and my first one here is going to be, I'll call it graph greeting, and I'm going to have it inherit FB graph object at end, and I will add one property to it, strong, in a string URL. So the way we built out this part of the SDK, we decided that if you're going to have both our Graph API and the Open Graph API, where you need to have structured access to server-side objects, it could get a little bit cumbersome to actually write classes that had boilerplate implementations for every single method. So instead what we did is we built out some infrastructure that will infer what the shape of the object should be on the wire based on the shape of a protocol in Objective-C. So this URL property here correlates to the server-side property for, here, let me close this, for my greeting object. And if I click over here, you will see that it has a URL property right there. Similarly, when I come back to my code, I will create another protocol for my action. Graph say action, FB open graph action. And I'll add a property of type HF graph greeting. Oops, sorry. Of type ID implementing greeting. All right. So here I've created some facade protocols. Facade protocol for my graph object. In fact, be a little more precise in my terminology. And a facade protocol for my OG action. All right. Show of hands, who's familiar with the concept of a protocol in Objective-C? You guys are all comfortable with that? For those of you that aren't, protocol is awfully similar to, but not precisely the same as, an interface in Java. So that should cover the folks whose hands didn't go up. At least for what? Or .NET, yes. Awfully close, but again, not exactly the same as. But yes. By the time we have Java, .NET, and Objective-C, I bet we've got pretty close to everybody in the room, but I won't ask you to show your hands if that doesn't cover you. Perl? All right. So here we have our two protocols. And now let me write some code to new up some objects. Well, to instantiate some objects and publish them. All right. So back to my post say action with greeting. So here I'm going to create, first I will create my greeting object. So ID, hi Facebook, graph greeting equals, and I do have to cast with our API here today, which bugs me, which is why I mention it. FB graph object. Here's a little background thread to start in each of your heads. If you have a clever idea for a way I can make this API not make me have to cast here a la templates, I'd love to hear it after the fact, because it nags at me every time I have to do that. But graph object, and what this is doing is this is creating an object which is actually inherited from NS Mutable Dictionary, and our system is wiring up some method or message forwarding logic so that we can cast it to any one of these graph protocols and just start assigning values to it, and it will store up the state so that it can publish it to the server. So that may sound like a lot of wiring, but from your code's perspective, you literally do something like this and then say greeting.url equals, in this case, URL. So this is that argument that's being passed in from the two handlers in the previous methods. How's this going? Am I going too fast, too slow, just right? Silence means everything is awesome, Jason, keep it up. That's how I interpret silence. All right, cool.
Or sleep.
Yes, there is sleep. Hey, I actually know of a case. It was Don Box. He was presenting and fell asleep. I will try not to do that. They all left, by the way. He woke up to an empty room. That was awfully nice of them. All right, so I'm going to create a say action here. So here's my action. ID, HF, graph, say action. Very similar code to the previous one. Again, creating an empty, mutable kind of starter object. And then action.greeting equals greeting. All right, so what I've done here is I've created my OG object instance and created my OG action and wired them up. So I have a very simple little graph here with two nodes, one action, one object, and now what I need to do is post it to Facebook. So I'm going to write the code to post it to Facebook, but then I'm going to write some boilerplate code around it. So I'm going to do things in a slightly reversed order simply to, I guess, represent the things in a linear way mentally. So let's start out here with FB request connection. And we saw a method similar to this one in Eddie's session, start for post with graph path. And my path here is going to be me, and then my namespace, which I believe I set to Jackal MDD, and my object, or sorry, my action type, which is say. And then my object that I want to post, in this case, is the action, although it does have a reference to that other server-side object hanging off of it. And then my completion handler. And my completion handler here, I'm going to start out with fairly simple handling. I'll say if, let's see, if not error. And in this case, I'll ns log and pass in the result in the success case. And in the failure case, I will pass error dot user info, which we will actually be coming back to later in the session when we start talking about error handling. All right, so this code right here is the basic wiring for posting my graph action. But as you saw in the previous session, we break out our permission requests. And so we actually need to get permission from the user to post on their behalf. So I'm actually going to wrap this in a permission request very similar to the one you saw in the previous session. So I'll say FB session active session, and then reauthorize with publish permission. I never remember to use this syntax, but I saw it in Eddie's, so here we go. If I get this wrong, I'm going back to old school. Publish actions. All right. Default audience, FB session, and we'll pick friends for this one. So middle of the road, audience selector. And then our completion handler here will actually be the code I wrote a second ago, plus an if not error. Oops. Put it in a code block. And then paste in this. That is a mess. Let me get Xcode to help us out here. That's also a mess. Here, let's do this so we can see it. All right, so recapping. Right here, we are asking for permission. And if we got it, then we are going to publish an action. Who knows if I got this right? There's probably something wrong, but this is at least the starting point. Yes. Did I? Yes. Thanks. Cool. All right, let's give this a build and run. There we go. Hello, Fred. And then, actually, before I even get started here, let's get our console up so we can see our log. So the log should come out down here in our output. And we'll click hello. Do we want to give it permission? Yes, we do. And so there, that actually means we pulled it off, which I'm standing a little bit in shock because that was the longest little code block to get without any errors. But that did post an action. And now let's go over to Fred's timeline and refresh. And here you can see that Fred said hello on MDD. That wording is a little weird, but we have some control there. Anyway, so there's an Open Graph action posted by Fred. And if we go back and click hi, and this one here, I'll show you a slightly more detailed way of looking at this. So here we have the hi action and the hello action posted by Fred. All right, that was kind of a longish bit of code. So anybody have any burning questions related to what I just did there before I move on to the next bit? Does that make sense? Yes.
What was the status of, you said something in the beginning about some of those Open Graph actions were just set up for developer use and did not have to actually be submitted to Facebook yet? How does that?
Right. How was that configured? Okay, that's a good question. So the question is around what, I guess, like the submission or publication status of these objects are. And right now, neither the hi action type, or sorry, the say action type, of which hi and hello are instances, nor I said that all wrong. The say action type and the greeting object types, neither of those are actually submitted and approved by Facebook. So what that means is that only Fred, Wilma, and Barney, and me, so we're like a little bedrock crew that can interact with these objects because we're all set up as developers of the app. If you go into the app tool, you'll actually see there are a number of roles. You can add testers, you can add developers, you can add administrators, and you can also add test users. I'm using Superfly internal hard-to-use test users. There are lighter weight, easier to use test users per app that you can just click a button and get test users for your app. And there are ways to support using them across multiple apps and things like that. So you have a lot of flexibility with what you can do with test users. Very similar to what I'm doing here, but not precisely the same since I'm using an internal test user. Did that address the question?
Yes, absolutely.
Cool. Any other questions before I move on to the next piece of this? Does it make sense? I didn't go into the value for your app as much as I am going into the code, but this would also be an okay to tie that together if there's any questions around that. No? All right, there was a question here.
Yeah, this is probably not the right time for it. I mean, maybe later on. Fetched URL versus canonical on Open Graph.
Yes, so do you want just a general discussion of the two? All right, so the question was around fetched URL versus canonical. in general, we just need a way of uniquely identifying the object based on the URL. Often, the two will be the same. But the canonical URL is the one that your application has said to us will not mutate and that you can use for identifying the object. Eddie, did I get that right? Did I miss a step?
Okay, there we go. Yeah, you got that right. One quick detail about that. The canonical URL, so a lot of times with these URLs, you see a URL that has different tracking parameters depending on like how it was published or where it was published from, or did it come through Bitly or whatever. Think of the canonical URL as the URL you want to use as the single source of record, as the ID that like we track for something that we're that like we Facebook are looking at. So we attach likes and comments and shares and then reports of spam and that kind of stuff against that one URL. If you have 12 different URLs that all point to the same thing, all of that positive feedback is divided across 12 different URLs, which essentially decreases the effectiveness of that one story. So think of the canonical URL as the like single endpoint that we use to like do all of that counting against. So it's in your best interest to make that thing actually canonical. And then the other URL is the one that like you can attach all those parameters to and do all that kind of stuff with. Thanks.
It should be at the end of the redirect chain. That is right, Eddie? Like there would be nothing beyond that. Yes? The answer to that question is yes. The canonical URL is at the end of the redirect chain. Yes. Yes. Conceptually.
So I can post multiple URLs that point to the same object in a redirect chain, but that's the final URL that the scraper arrives at is the actual key that you use in your database.
That's correct. There's also, now I actually understand your question a little better. There is actually a meta tag that specifies the canonical URL. And so it's not like we infer it from where you land. We actually pick it up from that meta tag. So if there are subsequent pages, they need to all share the actual canonical URL that you want to use as the identity. This one here, by the way, if you want to dig in deeper after the fact, we can go in more depth. Yes, one more question and then I'll move on.
So how would I use the custom Open Graph object on a mobile device to deep link into my app? Like, would it launch a custom URL scheme, or how would that? How should that work?
So in order to link back, or in order to post?
In order to link back. So somebody is checking out a Open Graph story, a custom Open Graph story that's on a feed and on a mobile device, and I'd like it to go to my app.
Yep. Deep question. Let's take that one after, because we're kind of at the need to move forward part. But please do come find me afterwards, and I will go through that with you, because there's a lot to that. And if we have time in the questions phase, I'm willing to take it there too. I just didn't want to do it here. Sorry to defer the question. If it had been a short one, I could have. All right. So I'm going to pop back to code. So a couple of things. This is a little bit of a departure from what I'm showing so far, but not an utter departure. What I want to do is I want to give you a little sense of how the various components in the SDK hang together. So in fact, if we could go back to slides just briefly, I'll point out what I'm referring to on the diagram. So far, we've actually been talking about these objects that we're using in memory and the objects that we're using for making the requests. But we haven't really talked much about UI. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you the kind of the simplified way to wire things between your UI and your Open Graph interactions. As just I guess a palette wetting thing, because it's not strictly about Open Graph. And then I will store off an NS array, and I'll name it friends. And then scrolling down, remember this was a sample application that already had pre-existing functionality. So in that, there was this friends picker, and all it does is pop up a message box and tell you what friends were selected. But I'm going to add to that just a little bit of logic here. I will squirrel away self.friends equals, and then the value of the selection property on the friend picker object. So I'm just storing off the actual selected set of friends, which could be empty. But now that I've stored that off in my property, I can come back to my posting code and say action.tags equals self dot friends. And if I don't want things to go deeply south here, not that there's anything wrong with the deep south, but I'm going to make sure I have something. All right, so where did this tags property come from? That bears a little explaining. So let me scroll up here to FB Open Graph Action. So this is the protocol that I inherited my custom protocol from. And if I use jump to definition here, you can see our definition of it in the SDK includes all of those automatic built-in properties of Open Graph Actions, and one of them is this tags property, which is an NS array. So now, assuming I didn't introduce a bug, if we run this thing, let me stop it, we should be able to, in addition to clicking hello and hi, pick some friends such as Barney and Wilma, who are also developers of the application. Say done. You picked Barney and Wilma. Now that should have been squirreled away in my property, and if I click on hi here, we should get an output that says we were successful. And in fact, let's go over to Wilma's news feed, and you can see that she's seeing activity by Fred. And if we go over to Fred and click on, well, actually, let's do it as Fred. It's a little easier to see. His latest one right here shows that Fred said hi with Wilma and Barney. So with just a little bit of wiring code, I was able to pick up the selection and then assign it to the property on the facade object. Here's why this works. We have logic in the SDK that says if you give us an array of strings, we will treat those strings as though they're IDs or URLs. If you give us an array of objects that have properties named ID or URL, then we will treat those as objects as well. So there's flexibility in what you actually assign there. Meanwhile, the friend picker just returns to you graph user objects which have IDs. So I have an array of those. I assign the thing to my facade object. I send it to the server, and suddenly I've now tagged my friends without having to write any of the plumbing logic to translate values. Did that make sense? All right. So that is the first part of my code demo where we go through the Open Graph stuff. Let's go back to slides briefly and see if I missed anything. No. All right. So I'm actually going to skip over the batching request stuff and give myself a little time at the end to come back to it. It doesn't fit in the flow linearly anyway, so it doesn't really matter where I do it. But I want to make sure that we talk about error handling. So one of the things that actually comes up a lot when you're building a Facebook integrated application is that the error cases can be a little non-obvious, particularly around authentication. And so how do you make your application tolerant to all the various cases? So first and foremost, if you remember nothing from the error handling session other than this topic right here is meant to be an exhaustive list, and that's no guarantee it is, but it's meant to be an exhaustive list and is a moving target of things that your application can handle when a request fails. And the good news is there's actually a fairly small number of common things your app should do in the case of a request failure. So while there are a variety of different ways it can fail, in general what you do is either retry the operation, or ask the user for permissions that you don't have, or reconnect the user to Facebook, which can happen if, for example, maybe they've disabled the application. And then finally, the fourth kind of common mitigation is to just pop up some sort of notification, either as an alert or squirreled away somewhere in your settings that says to the user, hey, if you want Facebook connectivity to work, you'll have to take some action. And an example of that would be something like, let's say the user got checkpointed, which is something that we can do on the back end for security reasons. The user actually only just needs to log on to Facebook again, and all their tokens will come back to life. But there's ways in your code to detect that situation so you can notify the user why their token's not working. Anyhow, so I'm going to show you an example of one of these kind of unusual cases. It doesn't happen every day, but when it does, many apps don't tolerate it super, super well. So I'm going to go over here to Account Settings and click on Apps. And a fairly common thing is for somebody to actually uninstall an app. So many apps tolerate that one. A slightly less normal scenario is that the user actually cracks this thing open and starts monkeying around with the permissions that they gave the application. So in this case, posting on my behalf. So maybe Fred's become a little nervous. He was embarrassed by something he posted, and whoa, was this app or was it not? And he doesn't know, so he panicked. So he removed this permission, and now let me go back to my application, and let's put some breakpoints in here for my handling logic so we can see what happens. My eyes are not good enough to really know. Is that, yep, cool. All right, so let's give this a run. And all right, so if we click hello here, it should break now in the error case, which if you go back to the request for permissions, there's kind of this question, hey, if the permissions are no longer granted, how come when I called the reauthorize with this permission, did it come back and actually apparently say there was no error? The reason for this is that this is actually iOS 6 saying, hey, yes, you've got this permission. And the reason it says that is because, in fact, briefly we did. And iOS just trusts the previous state. What happens in the SDK is that when we see a request come back that says, hey, this permission was not granted, we'll actually trigger iOS 6 to go off and refresh its understanding of what permissions the app has. So here this actually fails, although the code thought up until here that they had this permission. And if I let it run, you can see the output from the error is, all right, we have a code 200, which is in the range of missing permissions. And then there's also the message which says we require the publish actions permission. Now, this application doesn't behave that badly. It's not like it crashes. And in fact, if the user comes back and clicks on this again, now you actually get the behavior you want. The reason is because after having sent that request, the SDK went, whoa, we don't have this permission, and it asked iOS to refresh its understanding of what permissions the app has. So the next time we went through that reauthorize call, it actually did the right thing and popped up the message box. But that's not really what we want. So this is a fairly simple example of an improvement we can make here. So I'm going to come back to my code. And in the failed case, in this case, it's actually somewhat contrived to be simple. So let's say here, test to make sure permission error, which I'm not going to actually write the code. Really what I'm going to do is I'm going to have any error case here just call right back into the method that we are running here. So post say action with greeting, and then the URL. Is that the name of the argument? Yes, URL. All right, so what this does is gives us another crack at the permission request after iOS has had an opportunity to refresh its understanding of what the truth is, because we got a request that came back failed. And I'm going to unclick the breakpoints at this point, stop the application, let it run. And now we should get a better situation. So first of all, we do have the permission because I said yes a second ago. If I go back to Fred's app settings and say edit, and then remove the permission, and do the same thing we did a moment ago, now we get better behavior. If I say hello, you can see that we did in fact send the request. We did in fact get the error response. But we also went, well, what the heck? Let's pass this thing through again and find out if the user really wants this to be permitted. In this case, I'll say yes because this is an awesome app, and we trust it, and we're going to say yes, and we get our post. So that's a very kind of archetypical example of the kind of thing you end up having to do. Check the error type, and then go, is this a case where I need to reauthorize? Is this a case where I need to retry the operation? Is this a case where I need to reconnect? And like I said, there's only like 4 or 5 actual mitigations that your app needs to take. And that error topic helps you kind of go through the various codes and what they mean. Yes?
Is it instant? I mean, like, technically you said that, so I removed the permission, iOS is going to go refresh, you're going to recall the method in. The refreshing takes a while. Could it just loop there for a little bit?
Yeah, so that's a good question. The question is it instant? In this case, it isn't instant. I can't promise instant. But there isn't a race condition here unless there's actually a bug in the SDK. Our policy in general for these kinds of things is if we handle one of these little handshakes for you, our completion handler doesn't call you back until we've completed the operation. So what happens here is we call into iOS. iOS does its song and dance, calls us back, then we complete the operation here. So by then, iOS, unless it had a bug, which as far as I know there are no bugs in this spot, has gone off, fetched the truth, and then we call back into the app code. So there should be no second, third, fourth round here. But it won't be necessarily instant. That depends on latency and so forth. Yes?
What if you click don't allow? Would you not just continually ask for the permission again? And then are you supposed to test some error code to find out why it failed? And if so, what error code would you test?
Yep, that's a good question. In my app, because of the way it's structured, if I click don't allow, it actually doesn't just keep going. And the reason is because I've nested this thing in a kind of nutty way. And it's this that would come back false if the user said don't allow. So in this case, it's actually fairly simple. I don't have to test any error codes or anything like that. The inner one is the one that fails if the request fails. The outer one is the one that fails if the actual permission request fails. But your point is valid. At the end of the day, when you get into a real application with the varying different scenarios, you will, in fact, probably have to test the error case to determine what to do. Otherwise, if you just blindly keep retrying, you probably end up with a loop that just goes forever. In this case, it happens to not be the case. Yep. All right. There aren't like a ton more questions on this part, and I do have a little time left, so now I'm going to go back to the batching thing. Is everybody okay with me spending a few more minutes on batching? I'm getting nods, and remember what silence means, so we're in awesome shape right now. Okay, so here we are in FB request connections start for post with graph path, and what this actually is a friendly helper method that actually wraps up like a two-step operation. So what I'm going to do first, before I jump into batching, is I'm actually going to break this apart into what it's wrapping. So what it's wrapping is the creation of a request object. So rather than call this request connection, I'm going to say FB request for graph path, blah, 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 square bracket, semicolon. Ay, ay, ay. That is not what I wanted. Not even close. Ah, it did it to me again. Stop, Xcode. There we go. Okay, there. So what this is an object that represents the request that I want to make, but it hasn't actually gone off and connected or done anything on the wire. And then the second step in the operation is to create an FB request connection object. Request connection, alloc, init, and then RC add request, where I pass in my request object, and then this is where the completion handler goes. And then the rest of it, aside from formatting shenanigans, can remain the same. And then RC start. All right, so far, I haven't actually changed anything. All I did was take one helper method that knew how to create a request object and then send it across the wire using the connection object, and it decomposed it into the more fine-grained steps that are going on under the covers. And just to prove for my own sanity that I didn't break something here, let's run it real quick, click hi, and see. All right, so we're still so far so good. But now that we're looking at this kind of the broken out way, we can easily add other requests into the mix and fire them across with a single actual physical request. And here's what that looks like. So I've already added the first request object, so I can even reuse the variable here. Not that that really matters, but I'll say r equals FB request. And we have helpers for constructing requests. So in this case, request for me would request graph.facebook.com/me. I could also do requests for my friends, which would get my friends list, or I can specify explicitly the path for the thing I want. And I will add that as well. rc add request r, I don't like that, here. And in this case, I think I'll just say nslog will assume success, like so, not like that, and then result, and just output the result. Square bracket, semicolon. All right, so what we have is a request object for the published action, a request connection, which is a little out of order and weird the way I've got this, but here we're adding the first request, and then we're adding the second request and firing them off together. And note that the completion handlers actually live with the add method, so the cohesion there goes with the request rather than with the actual network operation. And if I run this and say hello, what we should get here now is the output of the response when I fetch my own graph user object, as well as the output from the post of the action. So now I've batched two network requests as a single, or two logical requests as a single network request. The reason for this design is what we wanted to do is we actually wanted to decouple the physical from the logical so that you could write code that actually composes a larger request with different components. So you could create a request object here and a request object there. You can cache them. You could pick some threshold for when to fire them across the wire, or you could base it on dynamic conditions or what have you. And either way, your code is still just creating these request objects, adding them to the connection when you want to, and firing it across the wire. That makes sense? I think of this as a perf feature, despite the fact that it doesn't have perf in its name, because it allows you to decide just how many round trips you want to take in order to fetch the data for your app.